So this is the Sire Marcus Miller M7 and it's a fretless 5-string version. Now as you can see, I've been trying out a few of the Sire Marcus Miller basses recently. I have some of the V7 basses here which I'm going to talk about in a different video, but I want to start off by talking about this M7 bass. Now I've got both positives and negatives to say about this bass, but I'm going to start with the positives. Hopefully you can hear that it's a really nice sounding fretless bass and it's very playable all the way across its range. Whenever you're buying a new instrument, you should have two questions right at the forefront of your mind. Does it sound good? How playable is it? Meaning how easy to play is it? And this really ticks both boxes. It's a nice sounding fretless bass, it's really playable all the way across its range. It's got a really good solid low B string, and that's really important for a 5-string bass. This has actually got a 35-inch scale from here to here, and that's an inch longer than the 4-string version. Now the reason why you have that extra inch is to tighten up that low B string and try and get the tone a bit more consistent with the other 4 strings, and it really works. As you can hear, it's got a good solid low B string. So really consistent tone across its range. So it ticks all the boxes of a good fretless bass. It's easy to play, it sounds good, solid low B string. Having said that, there are a couple of negatives that I would draw to your attention as well. Now, I've been reading a few reviews about these M7 basses, and I've heard a few people who have compared them to owning an expensive custom shop bass. Now, you could spend thousands on buying a custom bass, and some of the reviews have suggested that maybe you could buy one of these which is a lot cheaper and it would be almost the same thing as owning the custom shop bass. Now there's a few reasons why I don't agree with that. Now one thing that all the reviews talk about with this bass is the preamp, and it does have a really good preamp on it. Now having a preamp on your bass essentially just means that you can set the EQ from your bass. So you have a bass boost, mid-range, which also has a frequency selector, and a treble boost. Now it is a really good preamp, it does sound really good. Now it also has what I would call an active-passive switch. Now active means that the preamp is switched on, and passive means that the preamp is switched off. So this is what the bass sounds like without the preamp. And when I put the preamp on, now all I've done there is just slightly raised the bass and the mid-range. That's all, just slightly elevated them, and it gives you that lovely warm tone that you just heard. Hopefully it comes across in the video, it might not, but hopefully you can hear that it gives you a really nice warm tone. If not, you'll just have to take my word for it. But that brings me on to my slight first negative comment, which is that ideally I would want my bass to sound good in both active and passive mode, but this really, you need to have the preamp switched on to get it sounding really good. Now that's not actually the case with the V7 basses. So as I said, I will talk about the V7 basses in another video, but I found that with those, they sound really good when you play them in passive, and they also sound really good when the preamp's switched on as well. Now I also want to talk a little bit about the pickups, and particularly these two little switches here which control the pickups. So this switch is for this pickup and that switch is for that pickup. Now the type of pickups we have on this bass are called humbuckers. Now a humbucker, each humbucker is essentially like having 2 single coil pickups, and humbuckers are traditionally wired what's called in series. To be wired in series means that the signal from your bass goes all the way along one coil and then all the way along the other coil. And what that gives you is a really big, solid, punchy sound. It's a very distinctive sound, the humbucker, completely different from a single coil pickup. If you want that humbucker sound, the sound of those pickups wired in series, then you need to have these switches in the down position. That down position gives you the proper humbucker sound, that fat sound. If you have them in the middle position, that gives you the sound of a single coil pickup. You're only using one of the two coils on each pickup. So let me give you the demonstration of the difference. So I'm playing on the back pickup and I have it set in single coil mode. Sounds like this. And now with the humbucker kicked into series, in the down position. Okay, so it's a big fat punchy sound, and it's a much bigger sound than the single coil sound. Now, these pickup selectors, they have 3 positions, and the top position is when the humbucker is wired in parallel. Now, parallel just simply means that the signal travels through both coils simultaneously. Most of the time I'm going to play in the down position, because if I'm playing a bass that has humbuckers on it, I want it to sound like it has humbuckers on it, and to have that sound you need to have it in the down position. But it's nice to have the option to play with a single coil sound if you want. You may just have a tune on a gig where you want to get that kind of jazz bass sound, and you can do that on this bass but just by switching it into the middle position. But the top position, I'm probably not going to use it very much. Now, Sire like to set up their basses with a very low action, and that means that the strings are set very close to the fretboard or the fingerboard. And I understand why they do that, because it makes the basses nice and easy to play, and I'm guessing that that's probably how Marcus Miller likes to set up his basses, and so they set them up like that. Now, it's very rare to find a bass manufacturer that sets up their basses with a very low action, because it's a dangerous thing to do. And with this bass, I've encountered some of the problems that you can get if you set your bass with a very low action. Now, I've made a video of when I first took this bass out the box, and you will see that the action was so bad that it was actually unplayable. You couldn't really even hear the note, there was so much buzz going on. Now, I understand that when the bass left the factory in Indonesia, the setup was probably perfect, but things like atmospheric conditions can change the setup on a bass. And once this had been transported to the UK and it arrived in the UK in the middle of the autumn and it was wet and the atmospheric conditions were completely different, the setup had changed to the point where I could no longer play the bass. It was so bad. It was the worst setup I've ever seen on a new bass. Now, it was actually a relatively easy thing to fix for me because I have the experience and I know how to do it. So what you get when you buy these Sire Marcus Miller basses is you just get a little plastic bag with 3 Allen keys in it. That's all you get. You don't get any instructions about how to use them. So if you're not an experienced bass player and you've never set up a bass before, you're not necessarily going to know how to do it. So what I needed to do was I needed to adjust the truss rod. Now, the truss rod is a metal rod that goes through the neck and it controls what we call the relief on the neck. Now, I'm going to do a totally separate video about how I set this bass up because I think it's a really important thing to cover and it's probably not necessarily relevant to this video. So I ended up having to do a full setup on this bass before I could play it. So I had to adjust the truss rod. I adjusted the saddles here. These things here are called the saddle. It controls the string height. And one thing that I would have liked to have been able to do with the setup but wasn't able to was to adjust the pickup height. Now, normally on most basses what you can do is you can adjust these screws that are at the top and the bottom of the pickup, and the pickup will raise up slightly because there should be springs under the pickups which push them up when you undo the screws. Unfortunately, when I took the screws out of this, it was still stayed rigidly solid. Obviously they've been glued in place, so you can't adjust the pickup height on the bass. It wasn't a massive deal. You can still play the bass and it still sounds good, but I would have preferred to have been able to do that. Also, I would have liked to have slightly raised the nut. So it's fairly common not to be able to adjust the nut, but I would have liked to have raised this up a bit, and obviously you can't do that now without changing the nut completely. But having said that, it took me probably about half an hour to 40 minutes to set this up and get it into a position where it was playable and it was sounding good. So, having sorted out the setup, there were a couple of other little issues that arose in the first 24 hours of me owning the bass. Now, first, there was a temporary fault on the bass boost on the preamp. So what was happening was I was playing with the preamp switched on and the bass boosted slightly, and then suddenly that bass boost would just cut out. And then I'd wiggle the controller a little bit and it would cut back in again, and then it would cut out again. So there was obviously some kind of loose connection. So I had to open up the back of the bass, had to unscrew this plate here, And yeah, I had to have a look around, tighten things up, check for loose connections. I managed to sort out the issue fairly easily, but still, you don't really want that sort of thing happening on a brand new bass. And the other issue that I had was around these stacked controls here. So if you look at these controls, there's 2 stacked controls here. So there's, let me just use this one as an example. I had the same issue on both of them. So this is the volume control on top and the tone control underneath. Now what was happening was, when I turned the tone control, it was turning the top control as well. So it was impossible to turn my tone down without the volume control going down as well. Now that's only a very, very small issue. I managed to fix it in about 5 seconds. But if you're a less experienced bass player and you don't know how to fix these things, it could be really, really annoying. So let me show you what I did. You can literally just pull these knobs straight off. You just have to pull them off, and what I did is, when I pushed the top knob back down again, I just didn't push it the whole way down. I pushed it down 99% of the way down, just so there was a little bit of a gap between the bottom control and the top control, and that completely fixed the issue. Sire call this bass the Marcus Miller M7, and they call these humbucker pickups the Marcus Miller Pure H humbuckers. Now these V7 basses, these are modelled on a Fender Jazz Bass style bass. Now this is exactly the kind of style of bass that Marcus Miller plays, and the endorsement makes perfect sense. You can see his influence all over those V7 basses, and they're really good basses for it. This M7 bass is really very unlike the kind of basses that Marcus Miller plays. I don't think I've ever seen him play a bass with humbucker pickups on it, so it seems quite strange to put his name on those pickups and put his name on the bass. So it is a bit of a slightly odd endorsement, I have to say. So another thing that strikes me about this bass is the price. Now when I looked up the retail price of this bass, I was slightly surprised by how high it was. Now this is the Swamp Ash version of the bass, so it's a 5-string fretless Swamp Ash version. Now the official distributor of this bass in the UK is a shop called Anderton's, and I looked up the price of this exact bass on Anderton's, and it's £749. Now on Sire USA, the same bass is $959. Now that's not super cheap. So the thing that everybody says about these Sire basses is that they're like professional quality instruments, but for a cheaper price. Now, I would argue that for a lot of the reasons I've given you already, these are not quite professional quality instruments. They are really nice sounding basses, but there's a few things about them which are not quite as good as professional quality instruments. And I would argue that for that kind of money, for nearly $1,000, there's probably other fretless basses out there you could find which sound maybe as good as this one. So in conclusion, I would say that this Sire Marcus Miller M7 is a really nice sounding, comfortable to play 5-string fretless bass. Is it as good as the kind of custom shop basses that I've seen it compared to? No, it's not the same thing as owning a really good custom shop bass, but it is a nice sounding fretless bass. I would give it a 7 out of 10. It's not a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10, but it is a nice sounding, playable 5-string fretless bass. I'm going to finish off by playing one more tune, one of my own tunes from my book, Electric Bass Improve Your Groove. And I'm just going to show you how I've got the bass set up for the sound. I've got the pickups set on both pickups. So generally I either use the bridge pickup on its own or I use both pickups. Now here I'm using both pickups, and I've got my bass slightly elevated, the preamp switched on obviously, and the mid-range slightly elevated again. And the pickups are both in humbucker mode, so they're in series mode in the down position.